Good morning, everyone. Let's see. This is another in a series of presentations that I and a whole gaggle of us are giving on the course of the cruise. And when I got up this morning, I was Don Campbell, one of your destination enrichment lecturers. Now, in the future, I'm going to also be giving other lectures about the countries we visit, as well as a couple more things that might have to do with ships. I know everybody likes ship stuff, but that's okay. Susie and I were here in these ports, the ports we're going through right now, just last month when we came south on Marina from Lisbon. So the information we have kind of is pretty current. We can tell you about the wonderful marketplaces and some of the things that you see, but you'll have to catch us out and about the ship, and we're more than happy to meet with anybody anywhere, well, almost anywhere. I like to talk about the culture and some of the history about the places, and those are the things we're going to talk a little bit about today. We're going to explore today the natural and cultural history of the countries of Angola and Sao Tome and Principe. Now, the name Angola comes from the Portuguese colonial name, Reino de Angola, or Kingdom of Angola. The title Angola, which is just Angola, was held by the kings of Angola. That was a kingdom that was up in the highlands of the country. And the Portuguese name basically doesn't go quite as far back. It only goes back to a royal charter sometime around 1571. Now, this beautiful country is about twice the size of Texas and 5 times the size of Great Britain. The Zambezi River and several of the tributaries to the Congo River have their sources here in Angola. The Zambezi is the 4th longest river in Africa. The Congo River, whose mouth and western end form a small portion of Angola's northern border, mostly with the Democratic Republic of Congo, is also navigable. Its basin is pretty much a very large resource for diamonds up in that province of the country. They were discovered in the main river channel as well as in the flats and the terraces along the floodplains along the side of the river. And with that, let's kind of sail off to Luanda. The most prominent place to explore Angola's geology, I guess, is called Miradora de Lua. That's about 35 miles southwest of Luanda. The name translates into the Moon Valley landscape. You can see it's pretty rugged looking. The valley's jagged cliffs and sharp pinnacles and deep gullies have been shaped by centuries, literally centuries of erosion. And it's located near where there are shallow sediments that currently produce about 1.5 million barrels of oil every day. Let's see, diamonds, oil, oh man, you can almost smell the money in Luanda. John will be talking a little bit more about this and the country since 1961, so I'm going to kind of go well before that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the country's culture. The first people in Angola were the Khoisan. They were hunter-gatherers, and they commonly today are called Bushmen, but that's kind of considered a little bit of an insult. They prefer to be called Khoisan. Recent estimates say that there may be 100,000 Khoisan people living in Africa today, and only about 5,000 of them live in Angola. The Khoisan languages are known for their use of clicking sounds. So when you hear people talk and they're using this language, they use clicks instead of consonants, like T and M and things like that. So examples of those sounds to English speakers are things like or all those weird sounds that we make when you're trying to make a horse go or you're trying to tell somebody that they did something wrong. And it really makes it hard to understand when people are talking. Anyway, enough of that. We don't have any horses to spur on, so I'll move away. From back about 2000 BC, or if you prefer BCE, Africa became the scene of a great human set of migrations. Sometime around 500 BCE, the Bantu or Iron Age weaponry enabled those people to displace the Stone Age Khoisan here in Angola. Today, the Bantu still make up about 3/4 of Africa's total population. They have many beliefs, the Bantu that is. Their children are basically taught to show quite a bit of respect because they're taught not to look their mother, their father, other elders, or even older brothers and sisters in the eye. They always keep their eyes diverted. The National Anthropology Museum is in the city of Luanda, It's located in what was once the headquarters of a diamond company. A museum opened back in 1976 and was the first institute of its kind that was created in Angola's post-colonial period. One of the main objectives of the then Revolutionary Council was to reaffirm the country's colonial culture and identity of the Angolan people. For a long time, they had been seen as inferior by their Portuguese colonial rulers. At the museum, you can see exhibits that demonstrate pretty much all of Angola's turbulent history, as well as the Bantu traditional culture. There are over 90 different ethnic groups in Angola, and they all speak a different variety of the Bantu language. And among the largest of those are the Mbundu and the Chakwe. Now, the masks and statues of the Chakwe people are regarded as some of the finest wood carvings in Central Africa. Chakwe masks symbolize various ancestral beliefs, and they were used, they actually still are used during rites of passage, circumcision, fertility, as well as puberty rites. And you can view these at the National Anthropology Museum, and if you come to visit us at our house in California, we have one we can show you as well. Anyway, the marimba that's being played here is inside the museum. It's pretty much a traditional Angolan instrument. It's a kind of a xylophone, if you will. It's made with wood, and they have different sized gourds that you can see that are attached. Those are kind of the echo chambers inside of the instrument. It can be played by 2 or 3 people, generally because it's quite large, and they use wooden sticks that are very similar to drumsticks that we see in the West. They produce a very highly recognizable sound that's very, very pleasant for all Angolans. Another prominent Angolan tribe is the Mwila. Each period in their life corresponds to a specific type of necklace. Young girls wear pretty heavy red beads covered with a mix of soil and latex. It's natural latex, not the stuff you buy in the store. Later, girls wear yellow necklaces that are made with wicker covered with earth. They keep those on until they get married. When they're married, they start to wear sets of these stacked beads. And each of these represents some phase or something in their life. They never, ever take the necklaces off and even sleep with them on. To protect their headdress, to protect their hairstyles, they also have a headrest for when they're sleeping. The Angola Mwila women are famous for their very special hairstyles. You can get this in the spa, ladies. It's a discount that they're giving today and tomorrow. They coat their hair with a red paste, which is made of crushed red stone called ochre. They also put in it a mix of oil, crushed tree bark, dried cow dung, and herbs. I'm not sure you can get that whole combination in the spa, but you might be able to. Then they decorate their hair with beads and cowrie shells, and they even put on some dried food. All right, now you know where Lady Gaga got her really weird design for clothing. Except one thing is, the Mwila rarely ever eat meat, and they only kill their cattle for very special occasions. Instead, their normal fare is porridge, corn, chicken, honey, and milk. Mwila are not allowed to mention people's names in public. Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful back in the States during the election cycle? That would be awesome. I'm going to tell you all about... I love it. Anyway, Queen Nyenga was a 17th century Angolan queen of the Mbundu people. She's viewed as a heroine all across Africa. A major street in Luanda, it's one of the biggest streets in the whole city, was named after her, and there's a statue of her in a square off of that street. Now, many Angolans are married near that statue. It's traditional to get married there, and they get married near that statue on Thursdays and Fridays. That's their 2 days. Nyenga first appears in Luanda history when her brother was attempting to get the Portuguese to withdraw from the country. The Portuguese governor placed a floor mat down for her to sit on, which in Mbundu custom was appropriate for subordinates. Well, she didn't care for that a whole lot, so she ordered one of her servants to come in and lay down on the floor, and she sat on his back so that she could be at the same level as the governor. and that proved her worth as a brave and confident individual equal to the governor from Portugal. The Portuguese built several fortresses in Luanda, and of these, the Fortaleza de São Miguel is the best preserved and the oldest structure in town. In 1664, the fort was altered into the star shape to better guard the entrance to the bay. Then until 1975, that fortress served as a headquarters for the commander-in-chief of the Portuguese army that was based here in Angola. Today, it holds the Museum of the Armed Forces. The museum features things like a bimotor airplane, some other old airplanes, combat vehicles, and diverse arms and artifacts that were used during Angola's wars. There are also some pretty large and imposing statues of, among other people, Portugal's first king, and also the first European to reach Angola, Vasco da Gama. Actually, I'm not sure he was first. The lookout on the bow of his ship was probably first, but Vasco got the credit for it. There are a few other notables that are in the museum. And unfortunately, today they're building a lot of large skyscrapers and other buildings nearby, and there's a shopping mall that's being built right straight in front of the fort. The name Luanda actually came about back in about 1576 when a Portuguese explorer founded the city. He called it Sao Paulo de Assumpção de Luanda. The settlement had some 700 Portuguese people, of which half were soldiers. The Portuguese divided the Angolan people who lived here into civilized and native. Guess which one they preferred? The government basically petitioned the city, and some of the people were given the full rights of citizenship. Those were the civilized people, and the native people were not given full rights of citizenship. The requirements for that citizenship were a basic education in Portuguese and keeping or maintaining a European lifestyle. Central Luanda is divided today into the upper city, which overlooks the bay, and that's home to the places like the Presidential Palace and the Church of Jesus, or Church of Jesus. Downtown, or the Old Town, also called Bahia de Luanda, is near the port, and it features a lot of colonial-era buildings, and the Avenida de Marginal is the main street through that old town. Now, a lot of those old buildings are kind of like this. They're not in the greatest of repair, although there are some beautiful buildings and sites within the city. Near the outskirts of the city is the Benfica Market. It's well known for handicrafts, including fabrics, wood carvings, and ivory. Now, Luanda has the largest illegal retail market of ivory in southern Africa today. They did a survey back in 2014 of the retail outlets in and around Luanda. They counted pretty close to 11,000 recently carved ivory items. And none of them had the proper documentation and were all considered illegal. The pieces were all crafted in Central Africa and in Angola, mostly from poached forest elephants. Now, a little tidbit here. Unless you really want to run, particularly for the people from the States, and I think most other countries, unless you want to run afoul of your customs agents when you return home, I would strongly suggest that you find some other trinket than ivory as a memento of your visit. The Church of Our Lady of Nazareth in Luanda is a 17th century colonial building. It's adorned with Portuguese tiles that depict various religious miracles. Now, the governor at the time ordered the church's construction to give thanks for being saved from a shipwreck. That happened when he was on his way to Angola to save the people from the Dutch. The Dutch actually ruled Luanda for about 8 years, starting in 1640. In 1665, Portuguese forces defeated the Kingdom of Congo and decapitated their king. I guess that makes sure that he wouldn't come back. His head was buried in the chapel of Our Lady of Nazareth, and the crown and scepter from the king were sent off to Lisbon as trophies for the crown. Only a few decades after the arrival of Europeans in America, the demand for unpaid labor to work plantations made slave trading a very profitable business. The peak period of slave ships on the Atlantic Passage was essentially between the 18th and 19th century, although they did start quite a bit earlier and and ended, fortunately, in the 19th century. And that corresponded to the time when large plantations were being developed all across the Americas and in the Caribbean. To maximize profit, ship owners divided their hulls into holds to transport as many slaves as possible. There were horrific conditions. John talked a little bit about this yesterday. They had dehydration, dysentery, and scurvy that led to as many as a third of the slaves dying during their voyages to the Americas. You can get a pretty good understanding of some of that by visiting the Angola Slave Museum, and that's where countless slaves were bound for the Americas were processed. Capella de Casa Grande, near the museum, I think it's kind of interesting. It's where the slaves were baptized before they were put on the ships. I mean, why send all these pagan people over? You might as well send Christians. It's better to make them slave than the pagans. Anyway, ships known as Guineamen carried thousands of slaves chained to plank beds. The most significant routes of these ships were from the west coast of Africa to South America, the Caribbean, and what is today known as the southeastern United States. By 1790, between 5,000 and 10,000 slaves were sold here every year. Most slaves from Angola, in this particular area, were sent to Brazil. As many as 20 million Africans were carried out of the continent by ship. In 1807, the slave trade was outlawed by the United States and the United Kingdom. Within a decade, Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands also agreed to abolish the slave trade. That meant that slave ships that left Africa were pirate vessels. They were outlawed as pirates. The pirates then, slave traders, redesigned their ships to be faster and much more maneuverable so they could outrun the pursuing military vessels from the various countries. Finally, when the slave trade ended, Luanda began to export palm and peanut oil, wax, ivory, cotton, coffee, and cocoa, among other products. Maize, tobacco, dried meat, and cassava flour are also produced locally for consumption here. While still under the Portuguese rule, Luanda experienced a major economic revolution. Back in 1850, it was one of the greatest and most developed cities in the Portuguese Empire, and that was outside of mainland Portugal. In 1889, the gates of an aqueduct up in the hills were opened, and that provided a supply of fresh water to the city. And before that, that was a very scarce resource. European settlers began to move down, and they started to establish themselves in Angola. In less than 100 years, Luanda began to be called the Paris of Africa. I wonder why the Portuguese didn't call it Lisbon, but they preferred Paris. From 1911 to 1914, Germany and Great Britain secretly worked with each other and negotiated to break up the Portuguese Angola and divide the spoils among themselves. I mean, why leave little Portugal with all of that wonderful land? The Germans hoped that they'd be able to supply food and arms through Angola down into western South Africa. Portuguese government basically was able to fend them off, and they sent more reinforcements to Angola. A few of the German nationals in Angola were interned by the Portuguese. Finally, German forces in southwest Africa gave it up. They surrendered, and that ended the whole campaign. But Portuguese forces continued to fight with primarily the local people, the native people, who resisted the colonial occupation. After 1885, development of the Angolan countryside began in fishing villages like those on the Kwanza River. British and Portuguese investments prompted mining, railways, and agriculture. Forced labor was practiced widely. Portuguese presence in Angola was minimal for nearly 500 years, so calls for Angolan independence really got very little response from anybody else in the world. More active political and nationalist organizations finally began to appear in the 1950s, and John will talk about from then on, you have what we would call modern Angola. Now let's sail to the African islands of Sao Tome and Bumbum. Actually, it's Principe, but we're going to go to Bumbum as our port. They're part of the nation of Sao Tome and Principe, which sits almost on the equator. Actually, it looks like it's resting on it right there. With a population of about 193,000, it is the second smallest country in all of Africa. And our first stop is Sao Tome, the capital city of the country, and it's located on the island of Sao Tome. The island is about 50 kilometers or 30 miles long and about 30 kilometers or 20 miles wide. All right, now, we're going to give you a little thing here so you understand where we're going. Sao Tome and Principe is the name of the country. Sao Tome is the name of the island we are going to, and Sao Tome is the name of the city on the island of Sao Tome in the country of Sao Tome and Principe. You got that, right? It's a Portuguese-speaking country, and it's in the Gulf of Guinea. The Gulf coastline forms part of the African tectonic plate, and it corresponds to the continental east coast of South America. The coincidence between the geology of these two continents is one of the clearest confirmations of what's termed as continental drift. Now, here comes a drifter. Ka-thunk. At the former junction of those two continents, there formed a chain of volcanoes. That's called the Cameroon Line, and it's 1,600 kilometers or about 990-mile long chain that begins down in the Gulf of Guinea. The country of Sao Tome and Principe sits on that Cameroon Line. Actually, all the islands are part of that volcano chain. Pico de Sao Tome is a shield volcano that's on the chain. Now, a shield volcano, just so you understand, normally it's just kind of a big, slow, rolling thing. It's not usually a big high point. It's very similar to the lower volcanoes in the Hawaiian Islands. And that happens because the lava comes out. It's very thin, very hot, and it just kind of flows rather than erupting. So it doesn't have that big peak like a stratovolcano that you might see in, they say, St. Helens or in other places where you have these big peak volcanoes. Mount Fuji is another one. But erosion over centuries, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, actually caused that shield shape to look like this. All of the volcano eroded away and left only that central spire, which was originally the vent for the volcano that was the last thing to harden. So it's the hardest part of the volcano and all that's left. The Cameroon line of volcanoes is geologically unusual because it extends across both ocean and continental crust. Most of the lava that erupted here over the last million years was basalt. It's a kind of rock. And the best place to see that is the Boca de Inferno blowhole. That means mouth of hell. Waves enter an offshore underwater cave that goes all the way up under this set of rocks. And because it builds up pressure inside, it pushes these big fountains up out of the water when the waves come in. But as they say in destination services term, waves and big spouts are not guaranteed. If it's a calm day, you won't see anything at the blowhole except maybe an occasional little bubbling. If it's a pretty windy day with some pretty good offshore wind, you're going to see a lot of it. Anyway, this small island nation produces some remarkable flora, and that's due to the abundance of fertile volcanic soils. Mangosteen trees were introduced back in the early Portuguese era by the Portuguese themselves. The fruit kind of looks like a plum. It's a little bigger, and it is delicious. It's acclaimed to be delectable, have a slightly acidic flavor. In fact, the fruit is often referred to by people who like mangosteen anyway and who grow it as the queen of tropical fruit. This rare fruit is pretty picky about where it grows. There's only a few places in the world where you can even find mangosteen. And if you do find it, you might want to try it if you get a chance. Don't eat the rind. Now, the rind has a lot of antioxidant properties, and you can tell that because it's bright red, but it is really pretty bitter. It'll make you pucker for days. Now, the porcelain rose is the flower that's most associated with Sao Tome Principe. It's also known in English as the torch ginger, and being a ginger, you can eat it. You can eat the flower, you can eat the stems, you can eat the root. I kind of prefer the root a little bit shaved with my sushi, but you could eat the flower if you want. Anyway, one of the mainstays here on the island are vanilla orchids, and because of the volcanic soil, the island also has about 190 species that decorate the landscape. But when you're looking for orchids, don't look down. Most of them, maybe 75% of them, are up in the trees. So kind of look up and look around if you want to go out and see orchids. In the country, you're going to find the world's largest and smallest begonias. This is not hypoprosexia. The large version can grow to be about 5 meters or about 15 feet high. That's a big begonia. And that grows on Sao Tome. And then the smallest version is up on Principe, and that total plant reaches only about a centimeter, a third of an inch above the ground. And you can see from the fingers there that that's a pretty small flower. Anyway, those begonias are very tiny. The islands of Sao Tome and Principe foster very important marine turtle nesting sites. The endangered hawksbill sea turtle is one of the smaller sea creatures, sea turtles themselves. And this one's different because it has overlapping shell plates that are much thicker than any of the other sea turtles. And that protects them from being battered against the coral or rocks during storms. Now, these turtles eat sponges. Now, I've tried to chew on a sponge. I have to tell you, they aren't that tasty. Anyway, the sponges that these turtles eat, a lot of them are highly toxic, and they're lethal when other organisms eat them, so they have their own private buffet. Now, from November to March, that's the season that you might be able to see the leatherback, the hawksbill, loggerhead, and green turtles, and they come here to nest. And of course, after they nest, the little eggs hatch. Now, the females will crawl out from the sea onto the beach. They do that almost every night. Not each female every night, but different females every night. And they dig a nest, a hole in the sand, and they lay their eggs, and then they cover them back up, and then the female goes back out to sea. And then some 40 to 75 days later, the hatchlings happen, and they dig themselves out from that hole, and then they run down the beach to try to get into the water. But as they say, just like when I'm talking about the spout, wildlife sightings are not guaranteed. So you might not see any turtles. One of the more interesting birds here is the Sao Tome sunbird, also known as the giant sunbird. Now, I have to tell you, does that look like a giant bird? In terms of sunbirds, apparently it is. Now, you may hear it long before you see it because it really isn't much of a giant, and it sits way up high in the trees. And its usual song is a series of 3 notes. Each of those is about a second long, so it goes chee, cheep, eep, or sweet, choo, ooh. All right. Sorry, no more bird invitations. Now, keep your eye out for the world's smallest ibis. Now, this is another bird that's not exactly the biggest bird you're ever going to have. The dwarf olive ibis is about 60 centimeters or some 24 inches long. And it's usually silent, so it's not going to normally make a whole lot of noise unless it's disturbed. And if it's disturbed, it makes kind of an off cough-like grunt that happens. I'm not even going to try to replicate that one. Sao Tome and Principe are renowned for the abundance of their bird species, and as was mentioned earlier, they have the same number as found in the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific. The islands of Sao Tome and Principe were uninhabited before the arrival of the Portuguese sometime around 1470. Sao Tome was named in honor of St. Thomas by the explorers who arrived here, and they did that because they arrived here on St. Thomas's feast day. The first successful settlements here were established in 1493 by Alvaro Camina. He received a land grant from the crown, and that's what caused him to be here. Now, the island of Principe was settled around 1500 under a similar arrangement, and that island was originally called St. Anthony, of course, named because it was found on St. Anthony Day. It changed its name later on to Prince's Island because of Prince Henry the Navigator. That was in reference to the Prince of Portugal. The taxes and duties on the island's sugar crop were paid to Prince Henry. Why not? The National Museum of Sao Tome is housed in the Fort Sao Sebastiano, and it overlooks the Atlantic Ocean. And it's probably the best example of a well-preserved Portuguese colonial fortress from back in the late 1500s. The fort itself is the thing to see here, but the museum does have some interesting history. It has photos of the original found families. Well, I don't know if they're photographs of the original founding families, because I know that my little Kodak Instamatic wasn't around at that time, so they're probably drawings and paintings. But nonetheless, there are some depictions of them. There's also an exhibit that explains slavery and the way of life in the cacao and coffee plantations. And many of the islands, items that are in this museum and other museums down here have a very religious context because, again, the islands were very Catholic in nature. Population of Sao Tome is predominantly Catholic today. Say Cathedral, or the Cathedral of Sao Tome, is the oldest Christian church in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1493, the third Portuguese governor to the islands ordered the chapel to be built in this location. It was probably constructed for his gratitude at being spared from a slow death caused by malaria that plagued the islands at the time. Church was originally razed by Dutch invaders in 1501. It was rebuilt and destroyed again by the Dutch and then later by French raiders. Construction on the current building started in 1576, and again it was destroyed by the Dutch. I guess they just didn't like that church. Since then, the building has been renovated and improved until it reached its current form back in about 1958. Attracting settlers to Sao Tome, actually this was true all over Africa, wherever the Portuguese went, where they wanted to set up any trading posts and stuff. But attracting settlers to Sao Tome proved to be very difficult for the Portuguese, who wanted to come down here, be hundreds or thousands of miles away from their families, living in very primitive conditions in the equatorial regions where it's really hot and uncomfortable. But when the settlers did come here, they found that the volcanic soil in the region was very suitable for agriculture. Growing of sugar, though, which was their first primary crop, was a very labor-intensive process, and they brought many slaves in from the mainland to help with that farming. By the mid-16th century, Sao Tome and Principe were Africa's foremost exporter of sugar, but competition from sugar-producing colonies in the Western Hemisphere, mostly in the Caribbean and Brazil, basically hurt the islands. They just couldn't compete. They couldn't do it as cheaply. And the large slave population at Sao Tome and Principe was very difficult to control. Sugar cultivation on the islands declined dramatically over the next 100 years, and by the mid-17th century, the economy of Sao Tome had changed. It became primarily a transshipping or a transit point for the slave trade between the West and continental Africa. In the early 19th century, two new crops, cacao, if you will, and coffee were introduced to the islands. The Portuguese brought the cocoa plants from South America. By 1908, Sao Tome and Principe had become the world's largest producers of cocoa. The islands became known as the Chocolate Islands. Kind of makes you want to go there and have a little bite, doesn't it? Now, Portuguese companies and absentee landlords built extensive cocoa plantations that were known as rojas. The rojas system led to abuses against African farm workers, and although the Portuguese officially abandoned slavery back in 1876, the practice of using forced paid labor continued. I'm not quite sure what the difference is between unpaid forced labor and forced paid labor, other than that maybe you gave people a little bit of money each day. But it really was still only a form of slavery. And even according to an 1897 issue of the Scientific American, the continued use of slaves in Sao Tome was still being practiced. Sporadic labor uprisings between the Portuguese landowners and the native Creoles continued well into the 20th century. The Batepe massacre occurred back in 1953 when the landowners unleashed a wave of violence against the local natives, and several hundred African laborers were killed. The Batepe massacre remains as a major event in the colonial history of these islands, and the anniversary is officially observed and recognized by the government as a significant day. After that uprising, the Portuguese farmers imported paid labor from their other territories. They couldn't deal with the labor they had from Sao Tome and Principe, so they brought in other laborers from Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde. The Batepe massacre is seen as the beginning of the nationalist movement in Sao Tome and Principe, and by the late 1950s, a small group of locals formed what was called the Movement for Liberation of their country. It picked up momentum in 1974 when the Portuguese dictator Salazar was overthrown. The new Portuguese regime was committed to the dissolution of its overseas colonies. The two factors, the Sao Tome people and the Portuguese people, met in Algiers and worked out an agreement for the handover of sovereignty. After a brief period of transition, Sao Tome and Principe achieved independence. By the late 1990s, the cocoa crop was in severe decline, partly because of a crash in the worldwide price for the beans. Now, since cocoa made up about 95% of the exports from the islands at that time, the results were economically crippling. 1/4 of the farmers were left living below the poverty line. Now, in order to reverse the country's industry decline, the French organic chocolate producer Keoka was hired to assess the situation. Keoka found that if the farmers would certify their cocoa as organic, they could improve the profit on their crops. Of course, everybody today wants to buy something that's organic, right? I have some wonderful organic dirt in my backyard that I'd be more than happy to sell people, and I'll pay the shipping. Anyway, by coming together in cooperatives, the farmers here have managed to get a much better return on their cocoa, and they're now marketed as fair trade products. Fair trade, so you understand that, fair trade goods are just that. Farmers and workers on those farms are justly compensated for the work that they do. And that concept is basically worldwide and very supported by the United Nations. In the presidential elections here in 2001, the Independent Democratic Action Party won in the first round. For the next 4 years, they had I guess you'd call it a series of short-lived opposition-led governments that were formed and then just kind of fell away. And even the Army here seized power for a week back in 2003. That was a long one. Anyway, 3 years later, pro-presidential coalition won enough seats in the National Assembly election to form a new government in Sao Tome and Principe. In 2009, there was an attempted coup d'etat to overthrow the president, and all of the leaders were captured, convicted, and imprisoned. But the president pardoned them all. Now, I think that's pretty amazing. In 2003, the government of the islands agreed with Nigeria to a joint development zone over the Gulf of Guinea, which is just to the north of the islands. It gives Sao Tome and Principe 40% of all the oil revenues from that area. So right now, things are looking up pretty well for Sao Tome and Principe. Today, it is the smallest Portuguese-speaking nation with a census, as I said, of almost 200,000 people. The dobra here is the currency of Sao Tome and Principe. But the country signed a deal with Portugal back in 2009, and it links the dobra to the euro. Well, it may be really hard to understand people here because unless you speak Portuguese or one of the Bantu languages, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty because English is rarely spoken, but at least we can understand their currency. Bam Island, which is up off the island of Principe, it's linked to the northern tip of Principe by a 200-meter-long wooden footbridge. There you can see it. So when you go to Bam, you have a little walk in the sun. Anyway, Bam is a resort island that has extraordinary beauty. And it's in the same time zone as London, but Bam means good. And that's what you're going to say after you have a day of surprises here in this country. Now, watch for announcements of future lectures. My next one is called Out of Africa. It has nothing to do with people. And it'll be in a couple days. It'll be on our next C Day. This presentation will repeat on your stateroom television on Channel 9. And if you have any questions about these countries, our ports of call, ships, or whatever, you can meet me out in Baristas where we can sit and chat and have a cup of coffee, or any place out and about the ship. And I'd like to thank you for coming today. Have a great remains of the day.